The Kingdom of My Divine Will, in the Midst of Creatures, Book of Heaven, Volume 34, Part 3. April 21st, 1936. Divine Display for One Who Lives in His Will. How God renders her participant in His works. How He has always something to give and to operate together with the creature. I am always in the sea of the divine volition, in which I find the strength, the peace, the love, even more as I enter into it, on seeing my littleness, that I am good at nothing. The divinity, who loves so much for its will to operate in my littleness, arms its sanctity around me, its wisdom, goodness, strength, divine light, so that its will may find in me its divine qualities, in order to be able to carry out its operating act in me. Therefore, it puts something of its own, to give grace to the creature to let her operate in it. So I was following the acts of the divine will, and it carried me in its arms. It sustained me. It breathed upon me, to let me receive the participation of its acts. Then I arrived at the act of the conception of the Virgin, and I found myself inside the little heart of the Virgin newly conceived. My God, I don't know how to say it. I am unable to continue on. But my sweet Jesus, in order to let me comprehend, told me, "Blessed daughter of my volition, you are right. The waves of my will inundate you, drown you, and your little capacity remains lost. And you need your Jesus to explain to you better that which you see, but cannot express. Now, know, my daughter, that our love for one who wants to live, and does live in our divine volition, is such and so great, that we want to render her participant in all our works, for as much as it is possible to a creature, giving her also the merit of our divine works. As the creature enters into our will calls its divine works in act, as if it were operating in that very instant, and identifying the creature within its act, it lets her see the prodigies of its operating, and receive and be confirmed in that good, making her feel the new life of its act. You have seen the conception of the Sovereign Queen, and how you, being present in my will, found yourself as conceived within her maternal heart. See the great difference. For one who lives in my will, the prodigies of the Immaculate Conception were unheard of. My will, which animated this conception, and from which no one can escape, called all creatures to be present, that they might remain conceived within her virginal heart, and receive her maternity, her help, her defense, and find refuge and the support of this celestial mother. Now, one who lives in our will finds herself in this act of conceiving. She is the daughter who spontaneously, of her own will, seeks her mamma, and takes her place, enclosing herself in her maternal heart, to let the celestial queen be her mamma. This creature will take part in the riches of the sovereign lady, in her merits, in her love. She will feel within herself her nobility, her sanctity, because she knows to whom she belongs, and God will let her participate in the infinite goods and exuberant love He had in the conception of this holy creature. And so with all our works. As the creature in our will seeks them and calls them in order to know them and love them, we call our works in act. We place her in the center of them. We make her feel and experience all our love and the power of our creative strength. And the littleness of the creature receives and becomes filled up to being unable to contain any more. My daughter, not to let one who lives in our will participate in our works is impossible for us. Nor would ours be true love, because we possess by nature the communicative force, and would want to communicate our divine goods to all. It is the creatures that reject them from us. But for one who lives in our volition, we show off in communicating our goods. We find no opposition in her. And if it were not so, we would hinder our divine being. While on the contrary, to love, to give, to abound with our creatures is one of our happinesses. Now, see then the great difference from one who lives in our will. The other creatures are present in our works, in the conception of the Holy Virgin, in the incarnation of the Word, in my pains, in my death, and even in my resurrection. But they are there by virtue of our power and immensity. I could say almost by necessity, not out of love, nor because they know our goods, or love to make their dwelling in them in order to enjoy them. Not at all. It is because no one can escape our divine being. On the other hand, with one who lives in our will, it is the creature herself that seeks our works, knows them, loves them, appreciates them, and comes to take her place inside of them. And she loves and operates together with us. Therefore, as a consequence, she participates, acquires new knowledges and new love, while the others are there, but do not know our works. They do not love us. They have not a word to tell us. They are there, if one could say this, only to clutter our immensity, and many to offend us. Therefore, this is our ardent longing, that the soul live in our will. We have always something to give, and always to do with her. And she has things to do together with us. We give each other no time. One act calls for another, and we know each other well. Our will makes us known, makes us loved first, and then forms the perennial union of the creature in our will. Fiat. May 20th, 1936. Difference that passes between one who calls the divine will into her acts and one who does good works without it. The Ascension. How Jesus departed for heaven, still remaining on earth. My poor mind continues to go around in the acts of the divine will, and I thought to myself, what is the difference between one who calls the divine will into her acts and those who do good works but do not call it, do not give it the first place in their acts? And my sweet Jesus, making me his short little visit, told me, "My daughter, there is no comparison between the two. The first, by calling my will into her acts, strips herself of what is human, and forms the void in her human will in which to give place to mine. And mine embellishes, sanctifies, forms its light within that void. Then it pronounces its creating fiat, and calls to life its divine operating within the human. And the creature not only participates, but becomes the owner of the divine act, which possesses the power, the immensity, the sanctity, and the divine value that is never extinguished. Therefore, in one in whom our will reigns, we look and find our very selves, and our own acts that honor us, and form a crown around us. On the other hand, with those who do good works, but are not animated by our will, we do not find ourselves, but the finite act of the creature. And since we can't really keep anything of whatever good they may do, we give them the merit as recompense. A recompense is not a property that can always produce. Therefore, they are symbolized by those who live one day to the next, who, though they may get by with the salary they receive, never become rich. They have always the need to get paid for their work in order to live. And if they don't work, they are in danger of dying of hunger. That is, of not feeling the satiety of good, the life of the virtues, but rather the squalid misery of passions. On the contrary, for one who lives in our volition, everything is abundance. We say to her, take whatever you want, and as much as you can take. Even more, we place at your disposal our riches, our light, our sanctity, our love, because what is ours is yours, and what is yours is ours. There is nothing left to do than for us to live and operate together. After this, I was accompanying the ascension of Jesus into heaven. How beautiful he was, all majesty, clothed with most refulgent light that enraptured and chained the hearts to loving him. And my sweet Jesus, all goodness and love, told me, my blessed daughter, there is not one trait of my life that does not symbolize the kingdom of my divine will. On this day of my ascension, I felt victorious and triumphant. My pains were now ended, or rather, I was leaving my pains, already suffered, in the midst of my children, leaving them on earth as help, as strength and support, and as the refuge for them in which to hide in their pains, in order to draw from my pains the heroism in their sacrifices. I can say that I left my pains, my examples, and my very life as seeds, which, maturing and growing, would sprout the kingdom of my divine will. So I left and I stayed. I stayed by virtue of my pains. I stayed in their hearts in order to be loved. After my most holy humanity would ascend into heaven, I felt more closely the bond of the human family. Therefore I would not have adapted myself to not receiving the love of my children and brothers, whom I was leaving on earth. I stayed in the most holy sacrament, in order to give myself continuously to them, and for them to give themselves to me, that they might find rest, refreshment, and the remedy to all their needs. Our works do not suffer any mutability. Whatever we do once, we repeat always. Moreover, on this day of my ascension, I received the double crown, the crown of my children, whom I was taking with me to the celestial fatherland, and the crown of my children, whom I was leaving on earth. These two, symbol of the few who would form the beginning of the kingdom of my divine will. All those who saw me ascended into heaven received many graces, such that all of them laid down their lives in order to make known the kingdom of redemption, and laid the foundations on which to form my church, so as to gather in her maternal bosom all of the human generations. In the same way, the first children of the kingdom of my will shall be few, but the graces with which they will be invested will be such and so great that they will lay down their lives in order to call everyone to live in this holy kingdom. A cloud of light invested me, removing my presence from the sight of my disciples, who remained as though ecstatic in contemplating my person, for the enchantment of my beauty was such as to keep their pupils enraptured, so much so that they were unable to lower them in order to look at the earth. In fact, it took an angel to stir them and have them return to the cenacle. This, too, is a symbol of the kingdom of my will. The light that will invest its first children will be such and so great that they will bring the beauty, the enchantment, the peace of my divine Fiat, in such a way that creatures will easily surrender to wanting to know and love so great a good. Now, in the midst of the disciples, there was my mamma, who was present at my departure to heaven. And this is the most beautiful symbol. Indeed, she is the queen of my church. She attends to her. There is a footnote describing the word her, meaning my church. We'll begin again at the beginning of the sentence. Now, in the midst of the disciples, there was my mamma, who was present at my departure to heaven. And this is the most beautiful symbol. Indeed, she is the queen of my church. She attends to her, my church, protects her, defends her. She will then sit in the midst of the children of my will. She will be the engine, the life, the guide, the perfect model, the teacher of the kingdom of the divine Fiat, which she so greatly cherishes. Hers are the longing, the ardent desires, the delirium of maternal love, for she wants her children on earth in the same kingdom where she lived. She is not content with having only her children in heaven, in the kingdom of the divine will, but she wants them also on earth. She feels that the task given to her by God as mother and queen she has not yet fulfilled. that her mission is not ended until the divine will reigns on earth in the midst of creatures. She wants her children to be like her, and to possess the inheritance of their mamma. Therefore, the great lady is all eyes to look, all heart to love, to help whomever she sees somehow disposed to wanting to live of divine will. So then, in the difficulties, think that she is all around you, sustaining you, fortifying you, taking your will into her maternal hands, to let it receive the life of the supreme Fiat. Fiat. May 31st, 1936. How the divine will encloses all the acts of the life of Jesus, as though in act of repeating them always for love of creatures. The life of Jesus symbolizes the calling of the kingdom of the divine will upon earth. My poor intelligence was following the life of my sweet Jesus in the divine will, in which I found him in act of continuing his life when he was on earth. And oh, how many wonders, how many surprises of love never thought of before! So the divine Fiat encloses all the acts of the life of Jesus, as though in act of repeating them always, for love of creatures, to give to each one his whole life, his pains, his ardent love. Then my sweet Jesus, all goodness, told me, "My little daughter of my volition, my love wants to pour itself out. It feels the need to make known to one who wants to live of my will that which I did, and I do, in order to make it return to reign and dominate in the midst of creatures. You must know that my entire life was nothing other than the continuous calling of my will into their midst, and the calling of creatures into my supreme Fiat. In fact, as I was conceived, so did this symbolize the calling and the return of it, to make it be conceived in the creatures, who had so outrageously cast it out of their souls. And it also called them to be conceived in it. As I was born, so did I call my volition to be reborn in all the human works. In all my baby tears, wailing, prayers, and sighs, I called with my tears and sighs my will into the tears, pains, and sighs of the creatures, so that they might do nothing in which they would not feel the strength, the empire of my will reigning in them, which, moved to pity by my tears and by theirs, would give them the grace of the return of its kingdom. Also, my exile symbolized how creatures had exiled themselves from my will, and I wanted to be exiled, in order to call back my will into the midst of the poor exiled ones, in order to call them back and convert the exile into fatherland, in which they would no longer be tyrannized by enemies, by strangers, by vile passions, but live with the fullness of the goods of my will. And my return to Nazareth, how well it symbolizes my divine will. I lived in it, hidden. Its reigning was in full vigor within the Holy Family. I was the Word, the divine will in person, veiled by my humanity, and that same divine will that reigned in me diffused to all, embraced all. It was motion and life of each one. I felt within me the motion and life of each one, as my fiat was the actor. What pain, what sorrow, not to be recognized, nor receive a thank you, and I love you, an act of gratitude, either from the entire world, or even from the very Nazareth, where not only my will, but also my humanity lived in their midst, never ceasing to give light to whom could see me and approach me, in order to make myself known, while in my sorrow I remained always the hidden God. Such is the lot of my divine volition. Man was created with the creative power of my fiat. He was born, he was needed, soaked in it. My will administers to him continuous motion, warmth, life. He will end his life in the fiat. Yet, who knows it? Who is grateful to this divine act, so continuous, never tiring, enveloping with so much love the life of the creature in order to give her life? Almost no one, my daughter. To do good, to be the primary cause of conservation, giving perennial life to the creature, to maintain the order of all created things around her, and only for her sake, and not to be recognized? This is the sorrow of sorrows, and the patience of my will gives of the incredible. But do you know the reason for this patience so invincible and constant? Because it knows that its kingdom will come. Its life palpitating in the midst of creatures will be recognized. And in view of the great glory it will receive in being known as life of each life, and while it is life, it will receive each life in order to reign in them. It will no longer remain hidden, but will be unveiled and recognized. In view of this, it bears such great lack of recognition, and only a divine patience could tolerate the length of so many centuries of such great human ingratitude. From Nazareth, I went to the desert, where there was extreme solitude, and for the most part, fierce animals, deafening the desert with their roars, surrounding me, symbol of my divine will, which, since it is not known, forms its desert around the creature, and a solitude that strikes horror and fright. What is good is deserted, and the soul feels surrounded by more than fierce animals, that is, her brutal passions, that send out roars of rage, of bestial furies, of cruelty, of every sort of evil. My holy humanity kept retracing, step by step, all the sorrows that my divine will had suffered, in order to repair and call it back again to reign in the midst of creatures. I can say that each of my heartbeats, breaths, words, steps, and pains was the continuous calling of my will to make itself known by creatures in order to reign. And it also called them into my will to let them know the great good, the sanctity, the happiness of the living in the fiat. From the desert, I moved on to my public life, in which few were those who believed that I was the Messiah. especially the learned, almost none of them, and I wanted to use my power, sowing miracles, in order to form my people, so that if they would not believe my words, they might believe in the power of my miracles. Those were my divine and loving industries, for at any cost I wanted to make myself known, that I was their Savior, because if they did not know me, they could not receive the good of redemption. Therefore it was necessary to make myself known, so that my coming upon earth would not be useless for them. Oh, how my public life symbolizes the triumph of the kingdom of my Fiat in the midst of creatures, which I will make known by means of surprising truths. And in order to obtain the intent, I will perform miracles and prodigies. With the power of my will, I will call back to life those who are dead to grace. I will repeat the miracle of the resurrection of Lazarus, such that even though they have become putrid in their evil, rendered as stinking cadavers like Lazarus, my Fiat will call them back to life. It will make the stench of sin cease. It will make them rise again to good. In sum, I will use all of my divine industries to have my volition dominate in the midst of the peoples. See then how in each word I spoke, in each miracle I performed, I called back my will to reign in their midst, and I called the people to live in it. From the public life, I passed on to my passion, symbol of the passion of my will, which for many centuries had suffered the so many rebellious wills of creatures, who, by not wanting to submit to it, had closed heaven, broken the communications with their Creator, and had rendered themselves unhappy slaves of the infernal enemy. My humanity, lacerated, beaten up to death, crucified, represented the unhappy humanity without my will before divine justice. And in each pain I called my Fiat to exchange the kiss of peace with the creatures in order to render them happy, and I called them into it to make the sorrowful passion of my will cease. Finally, my death, which matured the resurrection, which called all to rise again in my divine Fiat. And oh, how vividly does my resurrection symbolize the kingdom of my will. My humanity, wounded, deformed, unrecognizable, rose again whole, of an enchanting beauty, glorious and triumphant. It prepared the triumph, the glory for my will, calling all into it, and impetrating that all might rise again in my volition, from dead, alive, from ugly, beautiful, from unhappy, happy. My risen humanity ensured the kingdom of my will upon earth. It was my only act full of triumph and of victory, and this befitted me, because I did not want to depart for heaven without first providing all the aids to creatures, for them to re-enter into the kingdom of my will, as well as all the glory, the honor, the triumph to my supreme Fiat, to let it dominate and reign. Therefore, Unite yourself with me, and let there be no act you do, or pain you suffer, which does not call my will to take its royal and dominating place, and conquer all as the winner, to make itself known, loved, and wanted by all. Fiat. You have reached the end of the Book of Heaven, Volume 34, Part 3. Fiat.